in Rome, or in Jerusalem, or in Sarajevo, or in Belgrade, or whatever other hotspot she's reporting from that day. For more than 2 decades, Sylvia Poggioli has helped us understand the world, particularly the world seen from Europe and reported on by a very astute American observer. Whether it's the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Velvet Revolution in Prague, the war in Yugoslavia, the Vatican's handling of the clergy sex abuse scandal, the European reaction to the U.S. intervention in Iraq, or something as simple and wonderful as the arrival of spring in Paris, Sylvia Poggioli always seems to be there. Her vivid accounts mix the sensible with the exotic, the down-to-earth with the profound, the bright with the dark, and in the end, we always feel a little bit wiser after hearing from her. I can tell you, as a diplomat in the Balkans during the wars in Bosnia and Kosovo, I learned always to trust what Sylvia was saying about the horrors that were unfolding in what was once Yugoslavia. And I'm convinced that it was brave reporters like Sylvia Poggioli, like Elizabeth Newfer of the Boston Globe, who was killed last month in Iraq and whom we mourn, who kept the spotlight on the worst human rights crisis in Europe since the Second World War, so that the world would eventually and finally do something about it. Sylvia is the daughter of Italian anti-fascists who were forced to flee from Italy under Mussolini. Before joining National Public Radio as a foreign correspondent in 1982, she was an editor for the Italian news agency ANSA, and over the years she has been showered with honors for her NPR reporting. Her early reports on Bosnia earned her a George Foster Peabody Award and an Edward Weintal Journalism Prize, and she later won the Silver Angel Excellence in Media Award, the National Women's Political Caucus Exceptional Merit Media Award, and she was part of the NPR team that received the Overseas Press Club Award for coverage of the NATO air war in Kosovo and Serbia. And then last year, Sylvia received the Wells Hengen Award for Distinguished Journalism from Brown University. Sylvia will speak to us tonight about the tensions between Europe and the United States over the Iraq War and, more generally, over American foreign policy as it is now being conducted in its particular unilateral fashion. To guide tonight's discussion, we are very fortunate to have with us another star of National Public Radio, Dick Gordon, familiar to all of us here in Boston and host of The Connection. A frequent Kennedy Library moderator, Dick previously served as senior correspondent for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's leading national public affairs program, This Morning. And during the last decade, he has covered the conflicts in Bosnia, Kashmir, Afghanistan, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and the Middle East. Dick has received 2 National Journalism Awards and 2 Gabriel Awards for excellence in reporting. So please join me in welcoming again Sylvia Poggioli and Dick Gordon to the stage of the Kennedy Library. Sylvia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really a tremendous honor to be here. I don't know about you, but the last few days I've been watching television a lot. Since I'm here, I'm not in Evian. I wasn't in Evian for the G8 summit, but I've been, like many reporters, closely monitoring what was going on there. And I think it resembled a little bit the court of Louis XIV. All eyes were fixed on the body language, on the pecking order, and everybody was analyzing the warmth of the handshakes, the intensity of the backslapping and the smiles. and everybody counted how many minutes the courtiers, that is the European leaders, were granted in private audiences to the leader of the world's single superpower. The G8 summit was seen as the testing ground to determine the state of the worst crisis in a half-century-long transatlantic relationship. Despite the assurances on all sides that the acrimonious debate over the war in Iraq was behind them, I think there were very few signs of a serious reconciliation. And meanwhile, a new controversy is bubbling. Where are Saddam's weapons of mass destruction? Many European editorialists, including some that have been consistently pro-war, are now wondering whether they were deceived by the U.S. and British governments. Now, the transatlantic crisis has, of course, been marked by personal animosities, by bad personal chemistry, by misunderstandings, national rivalries, and a series of diplomatic errors and miscalculations on both sides. And there have been many casualties. The main institutions of the international system, especially NATO and the UN, have been seriously weakened. The European Union's efforts to forge common foreign and security policies have been undermined. And the new US-Russia entente has been battered. And now analysts are asking themselves, what went wrong, and could this conflict have been avoided? How serious is the damage? What are the prospects for full reconciliation between Europe and the United States? In the lead-up to the war, during the fighting, and in its aftermath, there have been a great deal of international name-calling and even threats. There were mutual misperceptions on each side. Europe, I believe, did not fully grasp the impact of 9/11, the impact 9/11 had on American society and on the American psyche. And the United States underestimated Europe's deep abhorrence for war. As German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer has said, Americans have no Verdun. And the U.S., there is nothing comparable to Auschwitz or Stalingrad or any of the other terrible symbolic places in European history. And Fischer stressed that the process to create a united Europe is the answer to centuries of European wars and slaughter. This is one of the reasons why, despite their internal divisions, Europeans strongly believe in the role of international institutions and consensus building through international law, and they're wary of what they perceive as American hegemony and unilateralism. The Bush administration, on the other hand, sees the status quo as inherently dangerous and destabilizing, and international treaties as ineffective and a constraint on U.S. freedom of action. And sharp differences in the language used on each side of the Atlantic underscore the transatlantic estrangement. The word heard most often in Washington is threat, in Europe it's negotiations. The French analyst Dominique Moisy summed up the European view this way: the Bush administration has the great responsibility of having exported U.S. fears instead of U.S. hopes. I believe that this transatlantic crisis over the war in Iraq did not occur in a void. It's the result of a deep disconnect between Europe and the United States, not only on how they view the framework of the new international order, but also it comes out of deep social and cultural differences. The rift has been simplified as a dispute between two cartoon-like stereotypes: Bush, the trigger-happy cowboy, and Europeans as cheese-eating surrender monkeys. In reality, the roots of the crisis go back at least a decade to the end of the Cold War. It was in the 90s that one of the most destabilizing factors in the transatlantic relationship fully emerged. It's the military technological gap. It became increasingly apparent during the 1999 war on Kosovo. It was NATO's first war, it was the first humanitarian intervention, and it was conceived in part as a means to redefine the alliance's identity and to reassert the Allies' cohesion in the new post-Cold War period. But today, Europeans see the Kosovo war as their diplomatic and military debacle. The Economist called it Europe's humiliation. The campaign showed the great technological supremacy of the United States. And as the bombing progressed, the role of the European allies diminished day by day and became absolutely marginal. The military technological gap shocked the Europeans. They realized they had no satellite intelligence gathering capacity, no long-range air transport, and no laser-guided bombs. A report by the French Defense Ministry acknowledged with alarm a few months later that Europe is decades behind the United States in military technology. During the Cold War, European and American military spending was more or less constant, with Europeans spending 60% of what the U.S. spent. Today, the American military budget is almost double that of all the other NATO countries combined. With the exception of Britain, the strategic military imbalance is so wide that the U.S. really didn't even need the European military assistance in Afghanistan or, of course, in Iraq. And in the war in Afghanistan, Europeans soon realized they didn't even have effective transport to deliver their peacekeepers to Kabul on schedule. According to the New York Times, a country as rich as Germany had to rent Russian and Ukrainian transport planes on the commercial market. And one country NATO officials declined to identify discussed moving troops to Kabul by railroad. European leaders consoled themselves saying that they spend $30 billion in development assistance, nearly 3 times the U.S. figure. The Europeans provide about 55% of total international assistance and as much as 2/3 of all grant aid. EU Commissioner Chris Patton says this is our contribution to international security. Europeans soon realized that their vaunted soft power, the ability to influence events through diplomacy and persuasion, was not enough, and that their military irrelevance risked making them also politically irrelevant. Nevertheless, efforts to create a European rapid reaction force have been delayed by internal divisions and grumbling about footing the hefty cost, as well as by strong U.S. opposition. Many European analysts say that the United States has always in principle liked the idea of a united Europe, but in practice they say Washington resents European attempts to be more autonomous. This mutual distrust has increased since the Bush administration came into office. Many Europeans still remember when Donald Rumsfeld came to Europe on one of his first visits as Secretary of Defense and never once uttered the words European Union in his official speeches. The crisis over the war in Iraq has sharpened European suspicions that the Bush administration actively worked to divide Europeans. For example, with the infamous Letter of Eight published in the Wall Street Journal and the Vilnius 10 statement, both inspired by Americans. But this divide between the so-called new and old Europe is perceived almost exclusively in the chancelleries, because European public opinion proved much more united than the EU governments, showing a strong collective anti-war sentiment. The overwhelming majority of Europeans opposed war in Iraq without UN Security Council approval. This opposition reached a peak of 90% in Spain, in spite of Prime Minister José María Aznar's unwavering support for President Bush. European public opinion played a larger role in this crisis than in any previous international debate. Indeed, many changes have taken place in European societies over the last decade, and these changes also underscore the growing estrangement between the two sides of the Atlantic. With the end of the Cold War, ethical, social, and cultural issues have become much more prominent. Mutual incomprehension had been lurking for some time, but it fully came out into the open with the arrival of the Bush administration. There was much ill feeling over the U.S. decision to ditch the 1997 Kyoto Protocol and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and the American refusal to sign international treaties such as the ban on landmines, the International Criminal Court, and the Comprehensive Test Ban. George Bush faced strong political fire in Europe for his opposition to gun control, for his enthusiasm for genetic engineering, and especially for the death penalty, which is banned throughout the European Union. Abhorrence for the death penalty is so widespread in Europe that it's not uncommon for European politicians on their campaign trails to travel to the United States to visit American prisoners on death row. Today, Europeans consider the death penalty and gun control as human rights issues, and they do not understand why this view is not shared by Americans, who have always been the world champions on human rights. One of the most striking differences is the attitudes towards religion. While religion has a prominent position in American society, Europeans are deserting their churches in droves. Centuries of religious wars have convinced Europeans even to keep the name of God out of the draft of the new European Constitution, much to the Vatican's dismay. The idea that an American president conducts Bible studies in the White House and starts cabinet sessions with a prayer is incomprehensible in Europe. And Europeans strongly defend their welfare states, and they approve of state intervention. Even in Britain, despite the Thatcher legacy, polls at the end of last year show that 62% favor higher taxes in exchange for improved public services. Just the opposite is true here. But few issues have raised as much grassroots passion in Europe as what is known as the food fight. And I have to say, President Bush just didn't get it when last week he played the starving Africa card, trying to press European governments to lift their ban on the import of genetically modified foods. The food issue is a rallying cry across Europe. The British press calls genetically modified food frankenfood or mutant food. The French and Italian media periodically denounce big American agribusinesses for trying to tell Europeans what they should eat. The European rejection of genetically modified crops or hormone-fed chickens is rooted in the recent food scares in part, such as mad cow and foot and mouth diseases. There are other factors that have turned this almost into a battle of ideology and culture. Deep down, Europeans do not share Americans' trust in science and technology. Americans often accuse Europeans of being technophobic and hypochondriac about technological progress in the food industry. Europeans, on the other hand, see Americans as manipulating food, conjuring visions of the sorcerer's apprentice or the witches of Macbeth cackling over their boiling cauldron. The tone gets very strident at times. It often sounds like a religious war. But I think it's important to remember that food is a crucial element in Europeans' cultural and national identity and is closely connected with their traditions. Europeans today are proud when they say they eat the same foods and recipes their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents ate. So it's not surprising that, according to a European Commission poll, Europeans are more likely than Americans to view agricultural biotechnology as a threat to the moral order and more likely to associate biotech foods with menacing images of adulteration, infection, and monsters. Now, these different viewpoints may seem marginal, but with the disappearance of the common communist threat, cultural and social issues have risen in importance in international relations, and more than ever before, public opinion sets the agenda. This brings us back to the strength and nature of the anti-war demonstrations in Europe. During the Cold War, anti-American protests were inspired by leftist movements. This time it was different. From Madrid to Rome to London, the rallies brought out into the streets people who had never demonstrated before, middle class, middle-aged, and young couples pushing baby carriages. In Rome, on February 15th, perhaps as many as 3 million people marched, and the customary ideological red flags were eclipsed by the new and now ubiquitous rainbow peace banner. I attended other anti-war rallies in Paris and in London, and as a reporter, I never encountered any form of anti-American animosity. As an American who first went to live in Europe during the Vietnam War, I know something about anti-Americanism of the 60s, which was based on a leftist ideological opposition to that war. I perceive the European anti-Americanism of today as something very different. It embraces a broader political spectrum, and paradoxically, it coexists with a much more widespread appreciation of American popular culture than there was in the 60s. And every year, more and more young Europeans go to America to study. But Europeans increasingly see the American political establishment as distant and alien. Stanley Hoffman, writing in the latest issue of the New York Review of Books, described it this way. The anti-Americanism on the rise throughout the world is not just hostility toward the most powerful nation, or based on the old cliches of the left and the right, nor is it only envy or hatred of our values. It is, more often than not, a resentment of double standards and double talk, of crass ignorance and arrogance, of wrong assumptions and dubious policies. And all this has been very, very closely identified with the Bush administration. Today, even many of America's friends simply don't like President Bush, not only for his policies, but also for the manner in which he presents them. For Europeans, Bush's language is too strident, his habit of finger-pointing too confrontational, his view of the world too black and white, and his religious rhetoric simply alien. Several European analysts point to what they describe as the sharp decline in what has been called the soft power of the United States. That means the ability of a country to influence events through persuasion and attraction rather than thanks to the hard power of military and financial coercion. The French daily Le Monde synthesized European sympathy and solidarity with the United States after 9/11 with the headline, "We are all Americans." But that extraordinary feeling of support and sympathy has long vanished. The lead up to the war was a major diplomatic debacle for the United States. Not only did the Bush administration antagonize a long-standing American ally such as Turkey, it was also unable to win the support of more than 3 of the 14 members of the Security Council for a second UN resolution authorizing war in Iraq. Neither bribes nor threats were enough to secure the support of some poor African countries or that of traditional allies such as Pakistan, Chile, and Mexico. And now the effort to impose peace in Iraq seems to be much harder than Washington had expected. It's increasingly clear that the U.S. needs international help in peacekeeping and nation building. In fact, in the last few weeks, efforts have been made by both sides to find some common ground, and agreement was reached on some form of UN role in Iraq's post-war transition. And NATO agreed to provide support for Poland as it takes on a peacekeeping role in Iraq. But there's much that still divides the U.S. and Europe, and another dangerous conflict is looming just around the corner, the stalled negotiations in the World Trade Organization. This year, the moratorium on farm sector complaints expired, opening up a Pandora's box of disputes over issues such as genetically modified foods and EU agricultural subsidies. Europe and the United States count for about 1/2 of all the world exports, and a conflict between these two giant trading blocs could have devastating effects on world commerce and global stability. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank the Kennedy Library for just giving me the opportunity to sit with Sylvia for an hour or so. It's a delight to hear her perspective and to have a chance to interact with her, and I hope that you'll take an opportunity to do that a little bit later this evening. You'll see 2 microphones in the center aisles, and I'll chat with Sylvia for a while, and you'll hear my questions and decide that yours are much better. And just come to the mic, and we'll try and kind of split the time that we have left to us. You know, I noticed as well the writing about body language, because in fact, for the first time in about 6 months, the Americans and the Europeans were agreeing that this was the lead story. Le Monde was writing about the fact that Chirac guided George Bush to the photograph with just 4 fingertips on just one shoulder. The same time as Elizabeth Gumiller in the New York Times was saying, well, it was a swinging handshake for Tony Blair and something much more tepid for. It matters. I mean, when you don't get a chance to put a microphone like this on the aides who are whispering in the ears of the president, that's all you have to go on. And it's not necessarily a bad read of where they are, is it, Sylvia?
No, I think essentially, though, that became the story, because if you looked at it, there was no substance. At least this one I saw, as far as I could see today, there was practically no substance to the meeting. And I wonder also if this isn't also a Bush's dismissal also of these kind of events. He sees these, identifies the G8 summit, these kind of encounters beyond his gripe against President Chirac and Gerhard Schroeder. I think he just doesn't care about these kind of meetings anymore. He doesn't want to have this kind of cooperative meeting anymore.
The NATO that the U.S. used to lead is not the NATO that is as easy to control. There are almost too many chairs around the table. The G7s, the G8, and Jacques Chirac turns it into the G whatever with the president of China and Algeria. And, I mean, and in a way, that was France's snub to Bush, was it not? To say, see, we are genuinely multipolar, and you can see it in the way that we manage our meetings. I mean, the diplomatic fighting seems to continue.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think this is the big problem, because if this is the way it's going to be, there's just going to be, as Tony Blair said, the importance of this summit was going to be whether Europe and the U.S., the transatlantic rift will be repaired, or whether the two partners will continue to drift apart, will begin drifting apart. I think they have definitely drifted apart. And the question is, is there a will to bring them back together? I think certainly if the United States wants to repair relations with its European partners, it's going to have to put more emphasis on what's been dubbed the soft power, the diplomatic aspects, instead of only using hard power. Now, an event like this in Evian, it's the personal. We've seen the bad chemistry. Everybody's proved their role. But the problem is that there are important things around. Iraq has to be rebuilt. And it's clear that the United States is not going to do it on its own. It's also not just a question of, can they do it? Are they able? Who's going to foot the bill? Is only the United States going to pay for this? So I think, there are a lot of problems ahead also because the Europeans and the Americans see the aftermath of the Iraq War also very differently. Everybody thought a speedy end to the war is going to make everything okay. We're going to end the dispute. Everybody's going to jump back on the American bandwagon again. But it isn't happening. Most Americans tend to see this as a war that was successful. It freed Iraq from dictatorship, and there's less importance given to the issue of the weapons of mass destruction. In the case of the Europeans, they see this as having created more chaos and more anarchy.
Are you seeing that in the coverage, the day-to-day coverage?
Absolutely.
You will open the New York Times, and it'll be 2 more American soldiers were killed in an attack, but they persevere and they do this and they do that, and here's the plan, and this is what Bremer's saying today. Not the same story in Europe.
In Europe, it's seen as the U.S. is not in control of the situation. And I think the turning point, the very major thing, was the scenes of when there was the looting of the museums in Baghdad in particular. This was absolute turning point. In fact, Chirac at the EU meeting in Athens at the end of April called it, he actually called it a war crime, the looting of the Baghdad Museum, one of the most important art treasures in the world. And, they saw the people saw that the oil wells were protected, but not the museums and the library. And this is, Europeans see the U.S. is not in control of the situation. They're very, very worried about this.
Let's go back a little bit, if we can, to where this began to go off the rails at the United Nations, because there was that Security Council Resolution 1441. Everybody signed on. It seemed that despite the rhetoric, everybody was going to march to the same tune. And then, of course, the conversation, and you've mentioned it a couple of times, about weapons of mass destruction became louder and louder, and there was that dramatic appearance by Colin Powell at the Security Council, which seemed to indicate that the United States was going to go its own way. Now, what did that do for the American diplomatic image in Europe? And Colin Powell, up until that point, was seen as perhaps the only reasonable person that you could talk to at the White House.
In fact, that's exactly the way. He was the one person that they could look to. The Europeans said, we have nobody but Colin Powell in the Bush administration whom we can trust and we can talk to. After that, it was seen like he had been lost to the Hawks, too. And I think there was, if you remember, a dramatic event of a meeting, I think it was in February in a NATO meeting, when Joschka Fischer turned to Rumsfeld and basically just said, you have not convinced us. It was almost a shriek. You have not convinced us that the weapons of mass destruction issue. And now this is really emerging as a big thing. There's a big brouhaha now in the British media about possible erroneous use of the intelligence, that it was blown up, and Blair is under huge pressure now, under public opinion, and there's a demand for an inquiry. And Robin Cook, the former foreign secretary, who also stepped down just before the war started in opposition to this war, he said it was a monumental blunder, and he says that he felt that we have all been cheated. So there's a lot of concern now about exactly what the actual original motives for this war. Europeans are asking a lot of questions now.
What I'm interested in hearing from you, because you live on the streets that you report from, is whether or not the people, whether they're in Germany or in France or in Italy, are taking the lead from the politicians here, seeing the rifts that develop between Chirac's people and Bush's people, and then saying, yeah, right, let's be anti-American, they're anti-French, or whether or not the politicians themselves are seeing this groundswell of frustration or anger with the way that America is acting from among the average European people, and then the politicians reflecting that. Who's pulling the cart here?
Well, as you know, the European governments did not all agree. Britain, Spain in particular, but also Italy were very much, at least at the governmental level, were pro-war, and say the leaders ignored their public opinions on this case. The question is, where will this go? Because there were also local elections in Britain and in Spain and in Italy last weekend, and all these governing parties suffered substantial losses. In Britain, it was the Liberal Democrats seems to have gained quite a bit, not the Conservative Party from the Labour Party. But this could be the beginning of, I mean, certainly war was not the only issue because they were local elections, but they may be a message to these governments. On the other, I really think that public opinion has been very, very united in Europe on this issue.
But as you pointed out in your remarks to begin with, it didn't start with the war in Iraq. It began with frustration over Kyoto, over the International Criminal Court. And when you say that the Europeans never really got 9/11, I've also heard it said that the Americans never really got the EU, never really figured out that there was a certain amount of shared sovereignty, a big risk that the European countries decided to take. France, albeit one of the proudest of old European countries, if you want to use the old new phrase, had to say, yeah, okay, we're going to give up some of that sovereignty, allow the EU to speak on our behalf, and that was something that was never acknowledged by America, how much the Europeans gambled on even the creation of the EU. Do you think that's an accurate way of looking at it?
I think that's true, and I think the one example is how they haven't gotten how enthusiastic Europeans embraced the euro, the single currency, even though
more enthusiastic every day as it goes up and up and up.
Now, but I have to say, everybody got kind of cheated because what happened was at practically every country, prices, everybody took advantage because nobody could understand this. It was 3 months where you could have both your old currency and the new currency. It was all very confusing. And basically, shopkeepers and everybody took advantage, and prices rose 20 to 30%. Despite all this, in every country, not just in Italy, I know, but also in Holland and other places. Nevertheless, Europeans embrace the single currency with huge enthusiasm. I mean, there is a sense in many of these, to be a part of Europe is something very strongly felt. To be a European citizen, it's something that, of course, is the East Europeans, the members in waiting and about to enter, are also very, very eager to be part of what is now, they call the club, the European club.
Now, it was Rumsfeld who publicly said old Europe versus new Europe, but do Europeans themselves look a little bit askance at these former East Bloc countries, at the new European countries? Are they at all concerned about how the balance of power in the club will shift when the club gets that much bigger?
Well, there's a big debate right now because, as you know, there's been this work on creating this European Constitution, this new charter, which, of course, the Union now is 15 members, and in a year there'll be 10 more. It'll be 25. It's been very difficult for them to get their act together, to speak with one voice. As we all know, the Europeans have failed to do that. It's going to be much more difficult when it's a bigger union. There is some concern. Germany is concerned about there's still some fear about this whole influx of cheaper labor from these Slavic countries. There's still ethnic animosities. The Czech Republic is worried about the Sudeten Germans. There's some of the old problems, the old animosities that of Europe are still there. And there's a big debate between small countries and big countries on what to do about this sovereignty issue, whether to speak only the consensus issue, the veto power. It appears that it's going to remain the veto power, and that is going to probably just ensure that there'll be more and more paralysis. It's going to be harder and harder for Europeans to speak with one voice. There's still a lot of problems there.
And is anybody getting any closer to a long-term understanding of where Britain's going to fit into all this?
That's a big question. And I think I spent a lot of time I spent most of the war, I was in London, and I spoke to a lot of analysts to try to understand also their public opinion before the war was hugely against it. The polls started showing approval for a higher approval rating for Tony Blair as the war went on. It was seen primarily as approval for British troops. There was a very strong rallying around British troops, but still. The question, many analysts told me that in a sense, many Britons found themselves to be more European in their opposition to the war. There was something, and that this, in the long term, is something that Tony Blair is going to have to probably deal with. His own public opinion may be aware. Is it going to want to be more with Britain or more with the United States? And again, Britain, it's a mystery exactly. It's still an island. You really feel that when you're there, and they are not yet sure of their place. And so most Europeans still don't know exactly where Britain will be in the next 5 or 6 years.
And is the jury still out on Tony Blair's decision to back the war in Iraq as strongly as he did? I mean, if, for example, we wake up tomorrow and there's a radio news report on NPR that they've come across this huge stash of chemical weapons somewhere in a desert bunker in northern Iraq, you know and I know that that's going to change the equation and the reaction to whether or not this was a good idea in the long run.
Oh, absolutely. But I still, as I said, the public opinion was in majority against this war.
But Blair's in trouble right now,
He's in
more
trouble.
so than Bush over this. They haven't found any weapons of mass destruction.
Absolutely.
This is hurting him
Right.
day to day.
Very much so.
I mean, people are complaining about it in this country, but
there was
nobody has Karl Rove's personal.
Right. No, there was a report today that Claire Short, who recently resigned, again in opposition to the Blair's policies, she had threatened to. She was the international overseas development secretary, and she threatened to resign at the eve of the war, then didn't, and then resigned afterwards. But she came out just recently saying that Blair made a secret deal with Bush already in September to go ahead with the war, and this is creating a big beginnings of a concern and demands for an inquiry into this whole weapons of mass destruction. The people are, as I said, Robin Cook is upset. They're all feeling that he used the word, we've been suckered.
I want to ask you a question, but I'll start it with a story if I can, and I'll be short. Our program went to Baghdad for a couple of weeks, and one of the things that I heard there, which I found quite revealing, was that it was the same sort of thing. Everybody looked at the American reporters and nobody expressed any anti-Americanism. None of the people who were just out of their houses after the bombing, the month of bombing and the 2 or 3 days of the tanks rolling in, nobody expressed any anti-Americanism at all. And I said to my translator, Ahmed, I said, I don't get this. Had I been living in Boston after a month of being bombed by the Iraqis and an Iraqi reporter showed up on my door and said, so talk to me about this, I'd have been furious. And he said, here's the difference. In this country, in Iraq, people were so determined not to be a part of Saddam Hussein for all of his brutality and all of his dictatorial habits, that they said, we're the Iraqis, and that's the government. We're not a part of that government. That government doesn't necessarily represent us. And so we see America the same way. So when America does something bad to our government, we don't blame the citizens. Why would we blame the citizens? We've never had any say in anything that was done in our country, so we simply assume that nobody has any say in anything that's done in your country. It's like, But then you tell me that you're standing with these anti-war protesters in Europe who are determined, angry, throngs, furious at the idea that there's going to be this unilateral of sorts attack on Iraq, and there's no anti-Americanism there, and that puzzles me because I don't understand.
It's anti-Bushism. It's very, very personal. And I can tell you what, because many of these problems that I said, these cultural differences have go back before this administration. But when Clinton was president, Europeans loved him. I mean, there was, even if there were differences, many differences, cultural differences. For instance, also the war in Kosovo, most European governments did not really want to go, again, with the exception of Tony Blair's Britain, but the German and Italians and the Greeks really did not want to go along with this war. But it was Clinton's ability of his charisma, his art of persuasion that got them to do that. This has been totally lacking under Bush. It is so personal, the animosity, the sense of anger or fear. I'd say that what most anti-Americanism in Europe now is a sense of concern, and because they don't know what the United States is this administration is doing. It's very personal against President Bush and his Rumsfeld and the people around him.
You talk about fear. Do you mean Syria? Do you mean Iran, North Korea? What are these guys up to?
Everything. Just doing this. As I said, this scene. Iraq is a destabilizing. Again, the United States sees this as having freed Iraq. The Europeans see it as instead of having put an end to terrorism, they fear it has actually encouraged terrorism. They look at cases like the attacks recently in Saudi Arabia, in Morocco, and also in recent ones in Chechnya. And this is where they see the link now. And there's a fear that this kind of policy, they don't know where it's going to go. And essentially, as I repeat, it's the destabilizing effect. They fear the destabilizing effects of the Bush administration's policies.
No, this question wasn't actually written by Ari Fleischer, but it might have been. Bush goes to Aqaba, Jordan, on Wednesday, sits down for the first time since Clinton spoke with Arafat and Sharon, sits down with the prime ministers of Palestinian people in Israel, and it wants to push forward this roadblock. Is anybody saying, well, maybe the neocons have something here. Maybe something will work. Maybe the whole military exercise in Iraq has given the Americans a sort of, watch these guys, they're crazy, we should sit down and talk with them idea. So they're getting people to the table who wouldn't otherwise be at the table. I don't know whether or not America's sort of re-engagement in the Middle East is buying them any credibility in Europe, but they're saying, this is part of the plan. Watch us, follow us.
Well, sure. No, and I think that there's a lot of hope on that. The problem is, more broadly, even the whole idea of the redrawing of the political map of the Middle East to bring democracy to this area, to all these. It could be seen very positive. The problem is, again, the Europeans don't believe the U.S. has the constancy to do it, to be in the nation building, in the job of nation building. They look at Afghanistan. They don't see they don't think that the United States has got it in it, the desire and the will to do it.
Is that tied to the U.S. political agenda and the fact that this country is a year and a bit away from an election and everybody knows that things overseas aren't going to matter, or is it something deeper than that? Does it go back to that First World War and Second World War reluctance to enter? No.
I think they look at even more immediate situation, just looking at say Kosovo and Bosnia. I mean, the U.S. is more and more pulling out, certainly out of the NATO. Europeans are more and more, and other nationalities doing the nation building there. They just don't see the U.S. as having the patience to stick it out.
We should talk a bit about that, because you're just back from a trip through Bosnia, through Kosovo, and whatever nation building is going on there should stand as something of an example for Europe, for America, in terms of a place that is blown apart and how you put it back together. You went there knowing full well that everybody's keeping their eye on the weeks aftermath of Iraq, so that's in your head as well. What were you watching in the Balkans that was revealing for you about what's happening in Iraq?
Well, first, to separate a little bit the two, because Kosovo, it's been 4 years since the end of the war, and it is completely being run by a UN administration. Bosnia, the war ended in December '95. We've got now it's quite a bit of almost 8 years. And it was more of a hybrid. It was some UN, some international community, some European Union. Now it's mainly European Union and and many fewer NGOs, because also in these places, the international, they're no longer in the spotlight. Many of these groups leave because there's also donor fatigue and so forth. So I'll start with Bosnia. I think it's a very, and now everybody agrees in the international community that one of the major mistakes they made there was to have elections so soon after the war and so often. First elections were in September '96, less than a year after the end of the war. And what has happened, there have been 5 elections since then, and in 4 of those cases, the nationalist parties, the right-wingers, those who actually started the war, were reelected. And so the question is now, elections are a wonderful sign of democracy, but it's a democratic tool, but does it mean you're going to create, a democratic situation? when they had elections, when rule of law, the sense of safety had not yet been restored. There was no, and so the fear element convinced people to vote for the same people whom they thought would be protecting them. So this has been, I think this has set back Bosnia tremendously. At the same time, then you have very few refugee returns. You have basically, this was supposed to be this big multi-ethnic wonderful thing, and you have a totally separate ethnic. Sarajevo now is 99% Muslim city. The Serbs all live in the north. The Croats live in Western Herzegovina. And it seems amazing to me. I went there and I just did a story. One of those. It's just now are they beginning to do the international communities are trying to impose an educational reform, trying to create one army out of 3 separate military formations, trying to create a one customs service for the entire small country. And so what have they been doing? They've poured billions of dollars into this place. Well, nobody knows where this money's gone. It's gone half into the hands of corrupt politicians. There's organized crime is rampant. Nothing is produced in Bosnia. Everything is imported, even fruits and vegetables. There was a flourishing agriculture. So it's unemployment is horrendous. And a poll I read about carried out by the United Nations Development Fund says something like 90% of university students want to leave the country. So it's bad.
Why is it that a small factory, a small shop in Sarajevo that might have been producing something prior to the war can't reopen, can't compete, can't sell in its own country? Why is it that industry is just so stagnant?
Well, first of all, practically everything was, of course, the old communist system. It was the old, state-run. It was it's getting things started. There's no incentive. There haven't been the incentives for agriculture in particular. They say there have been no incentives for farmers. At the same time, I went back to Sarajevo last year for the first time in many years, and one of the things that surprised me was I remembered that before the war there was a wonderful mineral water, Sarajevska vodka. And I couldn't get it anywhere. You could only get something called Bonacqua, which is made by Coca-Cola. And everywhere you looked, every cafe, and there are many cafes, and everybody's sitting in cafes all day long, the young people, because there are no jobs whatsoever. And all the cafes have Coca-Cola umbrellas. And they all have a Coca-Cola refrigerator, and the Coca-Cola gives them the refrigerator for free as long as they sell this Bonacqua mineral water along with Coca-Cola, of course. So this year I went back, I did see there was a Sarajevska water had returned. So at least one, it had, in a year, somebody had started bottling that one again. But otherwise, it's a very depressing situation. And what the result is, the animosity of the Bosnian towards the international community is phenomenal. And
towards everybody, towards the Europeans, the Americans.
Everybody. The word is internationals now. There's tremendous resentment, and you'll hear just about everybody say these people are working here only because it's a good job, it's tax-free, and they have an interest in prolonging the protectorate because that way they'll stay longer, they'll have a better job, the job will last longer. And there's a tremendous cynicism.
Is that true?
I think there may be some people, but I don't think that. No, certainly not. It's not the policy. Certainly, I mean, there may be some people, but it's not the individual who has an interest in. I mean, but certainly these are heavy bureaucracies that have been created. Also, these nation building create their own kind of bureaucracies, and the same is true in Kosovo. And again, in Kosovo, where people, the Kosovo Albanian, where total, it's now 99% Kosovo Albanian. There are very few Serbs. I think in Pristina alone, there's one building that has 180 Serbs in it, and that's about it. In the capital of Pristina, there used to be 20,000 Serbs there, but that's not the only. But there, the impetus, they want independence, and they feel that the prolonged presence of the international community is just delaying their getting independence. You hear the same kind of cynicism there.
So, if the idea of going quickly to the polls as a gesture of putting a country back on its feet didn't work there, could it be an equally flawed plan to try and get ballots into the hands of Iraqis as a gesture, as a way of saying, see, the country is on its way to self-determination?
I think it could be a very bad idea. I don't know if I can really I don't know Iraq, I haven't been there, so I don't know, but if I should make the parallels. But again, there are three major groups in Iraq: the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shiites. Not quite exactly the same as the Serbs, the Muslims, and the Croats in Bosnia, but there could be a danger of just solidifying and creating sort of ethnic divisions of that kind, ethnic religious divisions. I think also one of the major lessons, another major lesson to learn from both Kosovo and Bosnia, is that local people have to be involved much more in the early stages of self-government. The Kosovars ostensibly have been allowed to have some roles. They have a government, they've had their elections, but basically they have no powers whatsoever. They're treated more or less like children there.
I've got just a couple more questions, so if you have anything that you want to ask Sylvia, perhaps this would be a good time to scramble to the microphones, and then we can sort of move from me to questions from the floor. I know it's a stupid question, but I like stupid questions.
So do I.
Is there anything good about the split? Is there, when we talk about the way that European leaders and this particular White House are not getting along, and in effect causing people on both sides of the Atlantic to ask questions, why? I'm just wondering whether or not, in your view, having that conversation, getting Americans thinking about what it is that's not connecting with Europe, and getting Europeans to ask the same questions. Is there anything positive about it, or do you see the long-term effects as being largely negative?
Well, I think the only positive thing there could be, but I don't see the sign of it, is if it could finally force the Europeans to get their act together and to create a more, speak with one voice. As I said, I see these new developments also there. I mean, there's still so many things that the Europeans have got their own social crisis, dealing with immigration and not knowing how to deal with it, and this problem of sovereignty, the small countries versus the big ones. Now it's going to be a bigger European Union, and I don't see, unless public opinion forces these governments to really speak with one voice. That is the only sort of positive thing I could say about it, about this rift.
And are people going to measure the differences, the distinctions between America and Europe, or the American leadership and European leadership, still on Iraq? Is that still the fulcrum point where people measure what separates the two?
Well, we'll see what the next developments are. If they're going to be, now we haven't heard so much about what's going to happen. Syria was in the media a few weeks ago. Then it was Iran. There's a lot of concern about what the next movements will be, if there are going to be any new wars. But I think Iraq was going to be. Everybody's going to look at that one, see where it goes.
All right, let's start here if I can.
What pressure do you think was put on Colin Powell to make him make a 182-degree turn overnight? I know they blame France, but I think it was more than that.
I don't know. I mean, I haven't really followed that. I mean, there was certainly a lot of animosity. I think there was a lot of anger between Colin Powell, and I think he was very angry at the French Foreign Minister, de Villepin. There are things that are beginning to come out now that were not so much reported in the American media, that, that France was also made many more overtures towards the U.S. Chirac did not rule out war, absolutely. And on the issue of the second Security Council resolution, the French ambassador went to the White House. I don't know who exactly he spoke to, if it was to Colin Powell or to who, but he basically said, why don't we just forget the second resolution, and let's just say agree to disagree, and let's try to gain some more time. The French wanted inspectors, a stronger inspection regime. So exactly, then there's another theory. In Europe, there's a growing sort of feeling that a lot of this, that Chirac was also trapped into this thing, that all this new old Europe rhetoric was aimed at, this is a theory, that to get him angry and to get him, the veto was what the U.S. actually even wanted, the veto, so that there could be this clearer division. This is a European feeling that the U.S. purposely wanted the division. I don't know if this is true or not, but that's certainly what's felt there. Many people feel that way.
So Colin Powell goes back to Europe now on a regular basis as Secretary of State. Does he have then less credibility because people feel that he's not listened to, or that he's actually gone over to the dark side? I mean, how do people see him?
Well, I think when he said in that interview on TV, he was asked, will France be punished? I can't remember the exact quote, and he indicated yes. I think that was it. I mean, I don't think they feel that there's going to be any possibility of dialogue there. I think the sense really is that the Europeans feel there's no dialogue with this administration anymore.
All right, one more from this side and then back over here. You go ahead. You were here first.
Thank you for a very reassuring presentation.
We're just here to make you feel better.
About us. And I think most everyone here and in the 30 previous assemblies in this room agree that Mr. Bush doesn't get it as to what the Europeans think. And he's not interested in listening to ordinary people like us. He has a dozen people around him, and my feeling is what's left except our media, the television and the press, and they're not on our side. How does one get them to see it so that finally Mr. Bush can get it?
I wish I had the answer. I have to say, I quote again, I think it was Stanley Hoffman in this recent piece of his, the York Group of Books. He said, at times it seemed even that the American media in Washington was embedded in the White House. So, I don't know.
If you want to be further depressed, look at the FCC ruling that came out.
Yeah, I'm not too much optimistic on that one either.
Thank you for that. And over here, sir.
On behalf of your many fans who listen to you and listen for you all the time, and think of you as a Cantabrigian, we want to welcome you back.
Thank you.
And I also want to say we tremendously enjoy your far-roaming reports from all over the place, and love it when you get back to Rome and resume your Italian accent. So my first question is actually about Rome, and then I have a second one, which is, and that's the Pope. Mm-hmm. There was a great campaign before the war began to get the Pope to go to Baghdad, to physically and by his presence block the war from happening. And there's been no talk since then of why he didn't. And I know the conventional reasons that he's old and infirm, but in fact he's planning travel right now. Do you have any insights? And then my second question.
Hold that one. Let's do the.
Okay. Well, actually, I think yes, it was certain Catholic groups in the United States also hoped that he would come to the UN. There was also talk about that.
Yes, but Helen Caldecott, for instance, ran an email campaign. Globally.
No, I think actually he was just it's true that his health, I think so. He did send Pio Laghi, a very close, important cardinal, to come to talk to Bush, and I think he realized that it was really more from the pulpit of from his balcony in St. Peter's Square that he could make this appeal. Going to Baghdad was not really going to. I don't think he felt that was going to be very helpful.
The language was strong.
His language was very strong. I think he can take. I think he had one very important goal in mind. Of course, he would have liked to have prevented the war, but I think his most important goal was to prevent that there be any physical conflict between Christians and Muslims. And I think he can take great comfort and say he was very successful. That has been avoided. I mean, there was in the Christian communities in the Arab world were not, in the Islamic world, were not attacked. There was nothing that. And I think he can probably say that was thanks to his very, very vocal campaign against the war.
Mm-hmm. My second question is about your statement that the Europeans seem to loathe Bush, but not Americans. And yet you reported to us that they're concerned about the crazy Americans who may bring us to another war, and you didn't mention it, but we're now investigating mini nukes, which aren't very many. And you mentioned the figures of 2/3 of Europeans were against the war, but the reverse was true in the United States. So how is it that Europeans don't, in fact, suspect us as Americans of being, and mostly see this as a Bush issue?
Well, I think, again, they'll say...
Some people voted for him.
Yeah. Right.
No, but I mean...
Something like 50%.
Give or take.
Yeah.
Well, they'll say, I mean,
Like.
well, they'll say he effectively convinced, the people, this sense of his having produced more fear than hope. Also,
So they think we've been duped.
Yeah.
And they're excusing us for the time being because
Yes.
we've been hoodwinked as well?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say that's... No, I mean, it really isn't against American society as it really was in the late 60s during the Vietnam War. I say that's certainly the way I felt being in Europe when I went, in 68. I really felt Europeans, it was very leftist things. I really did not like anything about American society. There was also infinitely more ignorance about the United States and about American society at the time. Today, there is much, much more knowledge. People travel much more. There's not as much naivete, and American culture is much more liked than Americans may think. But so that's why I think there's a more sophistication in the analysis, and that's why I think it's much more. It's a little bit like the Iraqis. It's the government. It's not.
But
it's not
there was a
people.
really interesting poll that came out last week, which said that I think it was people with who are better with numbers than I am may correct me, but college students, high school students in the United States were in a majority supporting the war. Hawks outnumbering doves 2-1.
I saw that.
These were the kids of the 60s generations, the people you were reporting on, the anti-war protests. Do you see any kind of generational turn and switch like that in Europe, where the high school or the university students may have a different point of view from their moms and dads?
In this case, I don't think so, because there were a lot of young people at these demonstrations, too. I don't think so. Not on this specific case. No, I don't think so. On this issue, no.
Okay. Over here. Thanks for that.
Ms. Poggioli, on September 11th, we felt the pain here of terrorism, and since we've conducted 2 high-tech wars, and particularly the war in Afghanistan, we've never been told how many Afghan civilians were killed, and it's a way of keeping us from feeling the pain or dealing with the pain we're causing. Could you comment on that, please?
Well, this is an old isn't this an old tradition of not? Well, actually, during Vietnam, it was always the opposite. Weren't they counting the bodies of the Vietnamese and not of the Americans? So, yeah. Well, there's a lot about the Afghan war, the coverage again of that war too, that I don't think we know very much about. I mean, there's many things that happen that are very unclear. I mean, I don't know what how the Americans were. There wasn't anything of the embedded journalism in Afghanistan.
No, there was nobody up there.
I think we know very little. Of course, that started also with Grenada. Remember that we don't know anything of what happened in that war. This is gradually becoming, I think we don't know much of what goes on.
Do you see anything in Europe about, because Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and other people are in there, and they're saying, best guess, 5,000 to 10,000 people killed. And that doesn't get a lot of ink in this country. I don't know whether or not it's a way that people are using to try and evaluate the war in Europe or not.
No, I mean, also, having covered the wars in ex-Yugoslavia, the numbers, it's a numbers game all the time, too. It's still today, there's a lot of arguing about exactly what the numbers are. The Serbs have never said how many people died of their own.
So do you think people don't wonder about it, or do they just think that the numbers are so manipulated whenever they're given that they're not worth trusting anyway?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
All right, thanks. And over here, sir.
Hi, good evening. There was an article in the Boston Globe several weeks back entitled Soft Balancing, and pretty much the crux of it was that in the times when there's only one dominant superpower, smaller nations somehow collectively unite to thwart the dominant superpower. And so do you think that perhaps with the admission of the 10 new countries, especially in the Eastern Europe, to the European Union, and perhaps in June 10th with Great Britain entering into the Euro, perhaps that the European Union might be the tool of the coming years and decades to somehow thwart what they perceive as U.S. aggression, and that will be the sort of the somehow balance off the one dominant superpower that they'll unite to thwart our efforts to what they perceive as our
Well, that's
aggression.
President Chirac's hope and dream, I think. But I think, no, I don't think it's like, there have been divisions also, and certainly this administration has been trying to also put more and more wedges, this whole new Europe, old Europe thing, trying to draw over to itself this countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. I think that's also much more, it's wishful thinking on the part of this administration to think that they actually are going to, be able to do that. But I don't know. As I said, I think the divisions and the problems of creating a united body out of these 25 very diverse countries is going to be very, very difficult.
But you look at the frostiness of the meeting in Evian and contrast that to Bush and Putin in St. Petersburg, where, they're smiling at each other. I mean, that's a pretty good example of that administration, the U.S. administration, learning how to use wedges, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is, I think. But the point is whether it will be successful, because I don't know what Russia has gotten out of this. Putin's Russia has come very much forward, made many concessions in the Senate. I think, Afghanistan, the American troops stationed all over the former Soviet republics, and no objections. Putin has certainly attenuated his objections about the Baltic states entering NATO. But I don't know what Russia's gotten in exchange for all this. There's been a lot of handshakes and everything. I certainly think if Russia and the European Union, or certainly with France and Germany, if they create a strong bloc together, that will be of great concern here in Washington.
Okay, thanks. Over here, ma'am.
Why do you think Tony Blair supported this war so strongly? And do you think he would deliberately mislead the British people about the weapons of mass destruction?
I have to say, I spent, as I said, 6 weeks there in London watching this, and I'm flummoxed by Tony Blair. I mean, I don't get it completely why. From what I understand, he truly believed this is really an ethical, moral issue for him. He truly believed in the rightness of this cause, and I have no reason to believe that that isn't the case. Clearly, he perhaps on a more looking at political thing, he probably looks at Europe and says, this is still a weak, divided entity. Perhaps Britain, it's more important now to be on America's side, and that was an important political move. I don't know in the long term, though. The rest of the Europeans are saying, Britain is going to have to decide at some point on which side it wants to be. It sort of is straddling the fence for a long time, and I think it's been postponed, this Euro referendum. I'm not so sure it's even, because there's division also within the British government between Blair and Gordon Brown about the Euro, and so I think he doesn't feel quite strong enough yet to have that Euro referendum, I think.
A fair amount's made about the sort of Christian affinity that Blair and Bush have on this war, on this issue. Does that get attention in Britain? Is that perhaps a part of the story?
That Tony Blair is a very, very religious person. Yes, indeed, and this is something that I learned recently. That there was Blair went to see the Pope just a few weeks before the war started, and it was a very private meeting, and it was everybody was very, very curious. And there's a rumor that when Tony Blair is no longer Prime Minister of Britain, he may actually convert to Catholicism, and that may have had some, and that his wife is a very, very fervent Catholic, and so I don't know. I put that as these are the things that were being talked about in the circle, or in Vatican corridors, anyway. So.
You heard it here first. Over here.
Yes, you mentioned that Europe never really got 9/11. Well, it seems in the past year that Europe never really got the Holocaust. There's been a resurgence of anti-Semitism in European countries, especially France, Germany, Belgium, with very little response for their governments. And it seems now even that many of these governments are hostage to their considerable Arab Muslim minorities. We'd like your comments.
Well, in terms of the Europeans not having gotten the Holocaust, I agree with you. I think this is really one thing that it's a subject that's not talked about much, but I certainly do. I think you're right. In terms of the anti-Semitic incidents, there has been certainly a surge in several countries. The case in France, it seems, from what's documented, that in great part they are the work of, they carried out by members of the Muslim immigrants or children of immigrants from the Muslim community. And there is concern, though, in France about that. I have to say that I was I was doing a series on Muslims in Europe. I did a lot of reporting on this in the early part of this year. And I remember having an interview with a well-known Moroccan writer who's been living in France for a long time, Tahar Benjeloun, and he first spoke to me with great concern about this rising anti-Semitism in the Muslim community. And the French government there have been many incidents in schools that are very bad. These are, as I said, the actual incidents against cemeteries, against synagogues, attacks. That comes from that sector. In terms of language and tone, also there is the old resurgent. There is a resurgence of, I believe, of anti-Semitism. One reads it, hears it also in newspaper editorials. I think particularly also in places like Britain. I think
How connected is it to headlines from Israel? I mean, last March when there were all the controversy over the attack on Jenin, that was a time. There was a lot.
There was even a group of British academics who, if I remember correctly, decided to not have to. There was a review that kicked out the Israeli members. It was a translators. I think, if I remember correctly now, there was a periodical that had to do with translation, and 2 Israeli members were just completely kicked off, and they decided to boycott any kind of events that had any Israeli members. It caused quite a lot of. I mean, there was a lot of scandal, about this. This was really quite shocking. And the height of it was last year, at the time of the whole Jenin, and there was an enormous amount of anti-Semitic rhetoric in, I would call it, in the Vatican media, in the Osservatore Romano, the Vatican Daily, and in Vatican circles at the time of the siege of the Church of the Nativity. So, yes, there is.
Thanks for that. Sir.
It just so happens that that's a similar line of questioning that I was going to ask you, but to be, let's say, more specific, I disagree a little bit with the previous questioner's statement that the Europeans don't get the Holocaust. I think they get it only too well, but on a subliminal and subconscious basis. I was at a conference in Vienna a few years ago called The Presence of the Absence, and it was dealing almost entirely with the gaping hole that the disappearance of European Jewry has left in the European consciousness. And there is an incredible unwillingness to deal with that, even in Germany, which ostensibly makes huge efforts to come to terms with it, but that's on such a superficial level. The other fact that I see, and maybe it's not a fact, maybe a peculiarly warped line of reasoning, and maybe you would comment on it, is the born-again tone of George Bush's Christianity essentially submitting itself to the far right in Israel's reasoning against the Europeans, because basically the Israeli response to European criticism of their actions is, what right do you have to, you have no moral standing as far as telling us what to do, because look what you did to us. And the fact that there is no even-handedness in American foreign policy towards Israel and the Palestinians, to speak of compared to our previous presidents, maybe part of the European distaste for George Bush has to do with essentially looking at American foreign policy in the Middle East and towards the Arabs, and again, because of the large constituency of Muslims in Europe right now, compared to the Jews are all gone, basically, looking as if the U.S. is hostage to Israel.
Well, taking the issue of this large Muslim community, I have to say that I don't think any European really feels it as certainly not on an electoral level as problem. I mean, Europe has a huge problem in dealing with immigrants and has an enormous blind spot to this whole issue of trying to integrate immigrants and, of course, Muslims in particular. So I don't think that, there is a sort of the pro-Palestinian thing is not so much dictated by this sort of large contingent. I think this largely pro-Palestinian sentiment in Europe has, first of all, an older tradition, older roots, leftist, 60s, this sort of seeing it as a liberation struggle, this whole third world idea, this tiers-mondisme and everything, and so there's a lot of that. And then subconsciously, yes, I think in terms of, there is this unspoken thing. It is anti-Semitism. It's just there. I mean, it's there. It's not. It's latent in some places. It's not. It has different causes. But it's there, and it's hard to separate it sometimes between that and anti-Israeli. And now, of course, this Bush being the whole Christian fundamentalist thing just helps reconfirm the prejudices also that Europeans have.
Thanks for your question. Over here, ma'am.
Thank you for your time here tonight. I was wondering if you found that the Europeans understand or see the many Americans that are anti-Bush and anti-war, if they understand that many Americans share their same sentiments.
Well, every time there's an anti-war demonstration, it gets huge coverage in the Europe. I mean, it does. I mean, especially on TV, you see it. And I mean, no, there is a sense that there are certainly. Movies like, what was it, Bowling for Columbine had a huge success in Europe. I mean, no, there is a sense that, and I think the movie that just won at the Venice Film Festival also had to dealt with a kind of Columbine. It was a fiction, but it was that kind of a story. So very critical of an American, So no, there's an awareness.
Thank you.
Is that encouraging? Over here, sir.
First, thank you for a wonderful talk. My question is, how would you address people like Robert Kagan and other Machiavellian authors who argue that the only reason that the Europeans are using the Lilliputian ropes of international institutions to kind of constrain the Gulliver of U.S. power is that, well, they don't have the power. And if one of the European states had the power the U.S. had, they'd be doing the same thing as the United States. This was in Robert Kagan's relatively new book, A Paradise in Power. And I'm very interested in how you would address it. Do you think that the Europeans have a different mindset or different perspective when it comes to international power now?
Well, I think the European would turn, this is the whole the Venus versus Mars, or Mars versus Venus school. Well, I think the European would react by saying that they don't really believe that there's this, they don't even really see that the U.S. is so Martial, because look at the case of the Kosovo War, for instance, the planes. So there was always this fear of Americans coming back in body bags and everything. I think the sense also is that the Iraq War was that it was easy. I mean, America had overwhelming force, and that there wasn't. It was easy to pick a war with Iraq because the army was insignificant. So I think the European will put down that argument and say, this is not really very credible. So,
okay, two more. Let's do these two here at this mic. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. Early in your opening remarks, you mentioned that there seems to be a great alienation and great misunderstanding on both sides of the Atlantic. Do you see any serious attempts on any level of government or any level of society of trying to breach this misunderstanding?
Well, we're right now. These are early stages. This whole thing has exploded in the last few weeks, and so I think everybody, as I said, was looking at what the leaders are doing. I think tourists are still coming here. Americans have declined. American tourism has declined tremendously in Europe, but I think I think there's still exchanges. I think people are. I mean, it isn't. It's now very much at the level of the of governments. I don't think. I'll have to say, what was very surprising to Europeans was the tone of the Europhobia tone in the media and all these. These things of, pouring French wine out and boycotting. This was really, that was really very, I don't know if that was exaggerated or not. I mean, I don't know if there have been huge numbers. Oh, this thing of not calling them French fries, and even in the, I think Freedom Fries in the Congress, I think they were actually, but you know what? Somebody pointed out that they forgot they did leave one other French word, menu. So.
Freedom Fries on the menu. Does that answer your question? Well, no, but I mean, it's interesting because part of what you're saying is put it at the government level. Why is it that there was no one at Evian who went, okay, enough of this. We're better off working together than apart. None of the political leaders were ready to make that kind of grand, humble gesture.
Yeah, nothing, exactly.
Any idea why? Is that playing to the constituents, or is that because the animosity really runs deeper than your average diplomatic spitting match?
Well, I think it's in Bush's court right now, because the French and the Germans have made some overtures in the last few weeks. There was the passage of the resolution at the UN Security Council. I think it really right now it's Bush's move to decide, to make the overture.
All right. Thank you very much, sir.
Had there
This will be my last question. We're a little tight for time. Go ahead, sir.
Had there been a discussion of American foreign policy in the first months of the Bush administration pre-9/11, it would either have focused on, or certainly would have included, a big country called China. That's dropped out. I mean, we haven't said China tonight. But China is still there. Do you see perhaps the U.S. and the Europeans vying for the affection or influence of China as the next half-decade goes forward?
I certainly think the U.S. will. I think China is further from Europe's mindset than it is certainly from the United States. But I think what's interesting about your question is that everybody has, periodically over the years, everybody says America's, even before the Bush administration, I mean, there was always this thing that that it'll be the Asia century, it'll be the whatever century, and that Europe and the United States will Europe is no longer really important. And yet, all this stuff shows that still this relationship is extremely important, even in its difficulties. It can't be, the drifting apart is going to be damaging one way or the other. There's just too many reasons why they have to work together, and so China is extremely important, but it is, for Europe it's far away. And I think the most important thing is the economic thing, because while there's all this, we talk about soft power, hard power, everything, I mean, Europe is almost equivalent to the United States as an economic power, certainly as a market. And the exchange, the trade is huge, billions of dollars every day. They got to work together. They can't, the gap cannot get wider. It has to, sooner or later, it's going to have to get narrower again.
You're going to force me to break my rules, aren't you? See, if I was hosting the connection, I could say, we have no more time. Near the clock.
It's
quick,
very simple.
last question.
Yes. I can't understand why we have such a great CIA and FBI, why we still cannot find bin Laden or Hussein. Why? We're so great in everything else. We know where Bulger is. We haven't got him.
You know what?
So I want to know what you think.
A wanted murder here.
Oh, I see. Okay,
I have another question, but
No.
Okay. Actually, it was a statement, but please answer that.
Well,
thank you.
Why?
Really? No, that's beyond me too.
Come on, you spend a lot of time on the road. You must be able to see somebody at the cafe.
Yeah, right.
I want to thank the Kennedy Library and the corporate underwriters, especially Sylvia Poggioli, for this opportunity. And John Shattuck for hosting us here. Thank you, John.
Let me, at the risk of inviting more applause, which I think are certainly well due here, let me particularly thank Sylvia for being and continuing to be and to build a bridge across the Atlantic. I wish there were more traffic across that bridge, at least at high levels of government in any event. And Dick Gordon for your wonderful and always wonderful way of questioning and bringing out the best. In this case, to have NPR and BUR having this exchange in the Kennedy Library, I cannot resist concluding this program for your listeners by saying this was Sylvia Poggioli.
Thank you.